and welcome to our first ever Forage Forum. I'm Emily McNerney, Product Manager of Ag Tractors.
And I'm Justin Fuhrman, Product Manager of Hay Implements.
Here at Kubota, we understand how much hard work and planning goes into hay and forage production, and we feel it's very important to help provide you with the latest knowledge and strategies for improving your yields. Kubota's hay tool heritage is built on a strong foundation. We've been introducing innovative products for more than 100 years. Our purpose is to continue to design, engineer, and build ag tractors and implements that meet the farmer demand and deliver maximum productivity in today's hay and forage environment.
We recently had the opportunity to visit Georgia to meet with 3 of the country's leading forage and animal health experts to learn about their best practices for high-performance forage management, reducing production costs, increasing profit margins, and more.
We learned so much, and we wanted to share those learnings with you.
For the producers on with us, you know all too well the differences between hay and forage, but for the purposes of today, we will be covering both references. Hay referring to animal fodder that is dried and stored, and forage referring to crops that are grown for independent animal grazing. So we'll be using the terms interchangeably as the practices we'll discuss apply to both. The information shared today will benefit all forage producers, from those raising livestock on pasture to hay producers. The science of forage agronomics is just as applicable to those managing fresh grass in the pasture as it is to someone storing the forage as dry hay.
One final housekeeping note: since the interviews with our experts were pre-recorded, we will be holding all questions to the end of the session when we will be speaking with you live.
Now let's get to know our experts. First up is Dr. Mary Ellen Hicks, Professor of Animal Science at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College, who will share her top tips for putting science into practice for forage management and production.
The very first thing that you have to do is you have to treat this forage as if it were a true crop. And talking about it in the southeastern United States, and saying that it's a crop, what producers would equate that to is maybe a row crop producer that's producing corn, or they're producing cotton, or producing peanuts. They see that as a true crop. They attach an importance level to it. That's an intentional attachment of importance. And if you first start out with that forage production and recognizing that it is a true commodity, it is a true crop, then you can start putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, whether that is to have it at the right maturity and recognize, hey, that's the right maturity, but according to the weather situation, we need to get in there and we need to harvest that right now to take advantage of the nutrients that we have placed into that forage. As my husband likes to say, we have enough factors working against us with weather. And with everything else that's going on, you have to start out saying you're going to make the absolute best crop possible. And that I am going to treat this as a crop. I'm going to be timely about my decision making. I'm going to do what the guidances say from our experts, the soil testing, the fertilization, the weed control, the insect control. Am I doing according to manufacturer's instructions on the maintenance of my equipment? If I'm not doing that and making intentional decisions, I'm not going to produce the best quality forage I can make. Well, a soil test is important from the standpoint that it is going to be supplying the forage that's growing on it. It's a living organism, the forage is, and it needs feed. And to keep that forage growing, you're going to have the nutrients there for it to grow from. So whether it's something that needs to address particularly the root system, with like a deep soil sample that tells us a little bit about deep pH in the soil, do we need to correct that to keep the plant growing year after year after year if it's a perennial? Is it something that we need to replace because that forage and pulling it off of that land, is that forage mining that nutrient? So having that soil test, the importance of it is to tell us how to replenish the nutrients that living organism in that plant is needing to be able to grow during that growing season. If it's a perennial field and it is dormant at a particular time of the year, Then what we're spending the rest of that year doing is looking back over what we did the previous year, what our results were on what we did do that year. Then we start looking forward and thinking about, okay, well, what do we need to do to be better the next year? Is there something that we can be doing during that off season, whether it's through the soil testing, which is something that we're going to be doing anyway, the application of any nutrients that we need to apply to it. For us in particular, it's equipment. That's the one variable that if we're right in the middle of harvesting and storing, if we've got an equipment issue, then that stops the entire process. So equipment maintenance is critical to us. Well, first off, to recognize there's always going to be a challenge. Cost is probably the one that affects producers the most, along with weather situations. In the case of more recent times, we're thinking about the cost of our nutrient application. If we're looking at increases in fertilizer costs, what type of adjustments do we have to make? And yes, we do have to make adjustments because of that. We have to think about what's our priority. And typically your first priority is going to be is with those nutrients, let's assess the pH of the soil, because science is showing us that the pH is going to determine the uptake of the other nutrients that we've placed in the soil. And so our first priority would be there, and we're going to meet those cost challenges first. It makes the use of the other nutrients, when you do spend that money for them, it makes them more valuable and more efficient utilization by the plant. I'd like to say that we had a recipe to be able to do this a certain way, and we always get that specific outcome with high forage quality. But reality feeds us a whole different situation. And what that means is sometimes where we're shooting for the absolute best quality that we can, but then adjust our puzzle and our components of that puzzle, of which input cost is a major part of it, and understand by adjusting that we may adjust the entire puzzle, which is the end result being that it is a high quality forage.
Those were really great insights from Dr. Hicks.
They sure were, Justin. I'm really looking forward to that Q&A. Now let's meet Dr. Jennifer Tucker, Associate Professor at the Department of Animal and Dairy Science at the University of Georgia. She'll be sharing her thoughts with us on optimizing quality from farm to feed.
That's an excellent question that a lot of people ask, and it all depends on how you store your hay. So after you harvest it, you put a lot of time and effort in creating a high quality product. A lot of times there's losses in quality when we store them improperly. By storing them outside, along fence rows, in areas where they get excessive weather, all of these factors can really have negative impacts on the overall forage quality. Now, if we take these same bales and we put them inside of a barn under some kind of shelter and kind of decrease that weather impact, then we have a really good chance of maintaining the quality of that forage we got at harvest. If you do have to store outside, some of our best management practice, we recommend that you store them in a north-south facing direction, so that if it does rain, that water flows by it rather than pools next to it. If you store them at the bottom of a hill, you're going to continually have that water sitting on it after a rain event. We also recommend that you stack them end to end so that the flat faces are touching each other and really get those close and in there together. And that's going to decrease any weathering effects around the bale and only have the most weathering on those outside bales. Another thing that we recommend is having at least 4 to 6 feet in between those rows. So again, you can have flow in between and not create areas of entrapment for any of those moisture effects that you don't want to have on your bales. Obviously, a lot of producers think that a barn is very expensive, but we tend to tell a lot of producers that a barn you're going to pay for either way, whether you actually have it or you have the loss in quality from not having it. I'm known for saying, unless you test, it's just a guess. And a lot of producers can estimate or think that they know what the quality of their forage is, but without having a forage test, you really can't be 100% sure. And some of the times we don't think about the variability that we even have within a single growing season. You have periods of drought, you have periods of excessive rain, and once you get to those cuttings, maybe one was 4 weeks and one was 6, you really have lots of variation in what that quality is. So by having a forage test or knowing what your quality numbers are, you can make better informed decisions when you're feeding your livestock. So now you know whether you need to give it to the animals of the highest need because it's your highest quality, or maybe it's going to require a lot of supplement, and so you want to save that for something that you add into a diet rather than the staple of your diet. So we always recommend having a forage test and knowing what the quality of those forages are. So there's twofold recommendations on when to get your forage tested. We tend to like for producers to get their forage tested at harvest or when they have their bales in storage. This helps for you making those decisions prior to feeding or getting into the feeding season, and that way you can already know what lots of hay you need to feed at what periods of time. The other way is if you're selling your hay, if you happen to be in the commercial hay production, by having that forage test, now you can sell based on the quality of that hay, and you want to go ahead and have that as soon as you pull that material out of the field. However, if you are going to store outside, or maybe you're in a baleage situation where you're doing something that's going to have maybe potential changes in that quality, you want to try to take a test as close to feeding that material as possible so you can ensure that that quality is there. But if you're storing it in a barn, you're going to expect that that quality hasn't changed much from that harvest time period. When we're looking at our forage analysis, there are a few key numbers that people tend to draw to or look at to determine their forage quality. The first being crude protein. And lots of producers really like to see what this crude protein number is. And it really is, it helps to kind of figure out what that protein value is in the forage, but it is a crude number. That's why it's called crude protein. And it's actually an assessment of total nitrogen in the forage times 6.25. But it can give you an estimate of that protein value. Now, most of our forages aren't really lacking in protein, but they're lacking in energy. So another way that we estimate the quality of the forage is by the total digestible nutrients, or TDN value. And this tells you what the energy of that forage is. Now, there are instances that you can have pretty high crude protein, but you also may have high nitrates because of the nitrogen factor in your forage. But if you have a high TDN value and you have a high crude protein, now you're looking at a higher quality forage. Another factor that we look at a lot is digestibility, both looking at NDF digestibility and in vitro digestibility. By looking at that, you can see how quick an animal can process, or the intake of that forage will be, and how quickly it will move through their system. The slower it goes, the higher fiber it tends to have. And we've had instances where animals aren't able to digest the fiber content in that forage, and the quality is so low on that forage that it can't meet those animals' needs. And so we can figure out all of these factors through forage testing and figuring out what those actual numbers are to determine what the quality of our forage is.
Well, after listening to Dr. Tucker's interview, I'm really seeing how important maintaining quality is throughout the process.
You're absolutely right, Emily. Every step is critical. Finally, let's get to know Dr. Lisa Baxter, Assistant Professor and Extension Forage Specialist for Crop and Soil Sciences at the University of Georgia. You can tell from her title alone, Dr. Baxter knows a lot about science and research, but used in ways to achieve the perfect blend in application.
So I'm often asked, what is the one thing that you could do to improve your forage or to improve your hay production? And by far, that's cutting on time. The more often that we can cut, the more we'll keep that plant into a vegetative state instead of getting into the more mature reproductive growth stages. The problem when we get into those reproductive growth stages is increases in lignin, we have greater cell wall contents, and all of those things are really indigestible to the animal. And so the more leaf material that we can keep on there and reducing those seed heads, the higher quality product that we're going to have in the end. So even though an individual harvest may not be the big phenomenal harvest that you've been expecting, when we add that up over the course of an entire season, We end up with more tonnage and higher quality bales because of that. So when we look at harvest height, it's tempting to want to go in, especially with these newer disc mowers, and really scalp that field down to get as much material as we can off. And while it may be okay if we're terminating a field and looking at renovation, it's not good for our perennial fields that we're wanting to keep for the next 10 to 20 years. So ideally, we want to leave at least 3 to 4 inches for most of our perennial grasses. Our alfalfa, we want to leave it about 4 inches. When we start getting into those native grasses, maybe even more. That residual forage height is critical for that rapid regrowth. The faster we can get regrowth going into that next growing cycle, the more competitive our grass is going to be, or our legume could be. The fewer weeds that we're going to have, it's going to be better against the pest pressure, and so on and so forth. One step really sets us up for success in that next hay harvest. We often lose more quality out of the fear of rain than the rain itself. So in most cases, what I'm going to recommend, especially warm season forages, it can apply to cool season as well, is that we go in, harvest that forage right before the rain. We might get that half-inch of rain this afternoon, we might not. And if we do, we'll come in the next morning, spread it out with the tedder, continue on. We're not losing a lot of quality right there after we cut. What's usually more, damaging for a lot of producers is that we've had everything lined up. We cut on time. We've got it raked. We are heading to the field with the baler, and then it rains. That's where no matter what forage we're looking at, we stand to lose a lot of quality. Those good cell-soluble nutrients that we really want to protect in those leaves tend to leach out if we're not careful. So the drier the hay, the greater impact of that rain. The higher sugar content in that hay, the more we stand to lose. So when we're starting to plan our hay harvest, we tend to think about the baling step the most. We hear that a lot in terms of what moisture we need to be at, because ultimately that's affecting the stability of our product in the barn later on. But there's some key moments earlier in that hay harvesting cycle that really affects our end product, and it's tied to the moisture. So if we start looking at the tedder, we need to be tedding when there's at least a morning dew on that grass to help protect those leaves, ideally above a 50% moisture. When we start getting below 50%, there's a lot of risk of leaf shatter, even if we adjust that tedder up and have a pretty light scattering of those materials. When we look at raking, it's going to depend on what type of rake we have. If we look at more of a wheel rake that gives us a more banded windrow, then we got to wait until it's 25% moisture or so to get in there and get started, because the windrow that wheel rake produces isn't conducive for drying. Now, if you've moved on to a bigger rotary rake, a more modern rake, those create a windrow that stands up taller and has more airflow throughout that windrow. And so we can actually start raking earlier, more at 35% moisture, so depending on where you're at in the country. And it will continue to dry while you finish raking and start baling. So being able to rake at that higher percent moisture helps protect those leaves. And that's ultimately where all of our quality is. Now, in terms of the moisture at baling, it's going to depend on what our product is. Most of us are producing 4x5 round bales. We want to get down to 18% moisture or so. If we have small square bales, we can usually stand just a touch more. The large square bales, it's really going to depend on your market. It's really tempting for a lot of producers to want to spend money on a lot of fertilizer. And so when we are asking what is going to ultimately affect my forage quality, it's really harvest timing. The payoffs that we're going to see from cutting a few days earlier is much greater than what we're going to see by adding 50 or 60 more units of nitrogen in that season. So when we look at what the most limiting nutrient is, that's where that soil test report it's critical for us as a forage producer and operator. We need to know what's going on below ground, because that ultimately drives the production we see above ground. Depending on where you are in the country will affect what that limiting nutrient typically is. For us in the Southeast and throughout even into the Midwest, it's potassium. We put so much pressure on nitrogen, and that nitrogen will fix our system. But if we don't keep that applied in conjunction with the potassium, then we don't have a good stand longevity. So for a hayfield like we're in today, we want to be sampling every year. Whereas a pasture, we can sample about every 3 years. And we'll usually set those up on a rotation so you don't sample and have to amend every pasture every 3 years. You can set those up on a rotation. The reason we want to sample our hayfields more often is we are collecting those nutrients in that forage that we're harvesting and then moving them off site. And so that's a large amount of nutrients that are being collected and deposited somewhere else. So it's going to induce a deficiency much more rapidly than we would see in a pasture. Lime affects so much that's happening underground. It's keeping our pH at that near neutral level, so it's going to help keep our nutrients available to the plant. It's going to prevent toxicities for things like aluminum, which is especially critical for legumes. And then it's also going to help keep the structure of the soil intact. We don't have a lot of herbicide options available for forage production, especially for that forage going into ultimately livestock feeding. So by far the best thing we can do to control weeds in our pastures and hayfields is to just have a good offense. If we can keep that ground covered, you're eliminating the light required for those weed seeds to germinate. You're giving that grass a competitive advantage over those weed species. Anything we can do to keep that ground cover and make that grass more competitive, it's just going to naturally lead to a more weed-free field. If we have any open space in our hayfields or pastures, those weeds are going to come up much faster. They're going to take advantage of that fertilizer you just put out, whatever rainfall or irrigation was put out, and they're going to grow much faster than our grasses. So if we never give them that opportunity, then we're already 10 steps ahead.
Hello again. Today, Emily and I are live from a studio at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College here in Tifton, Georgia. Thank you for joining. Now that we've shared what we learned from our panelists over the summer, let's hear from them live.
During today's Q&A, we'll be answering several questions that we submitted through our viewers. They range from forage growers, students, and also seasoned producers. Don't forget to use the Q&A function to ask more questions and participate in the polls throughout our Q&A. Let's get started.
All right, we got a good one right off the bat here. Dr. Hicks, what should I look for when purchasing hay?
The first thing I'd look for when purchasing hay would be to deal with a reputable hay grower and seller. So reputation means a lot. Word of mouth, satisfaction from other people, but that means that you've got a hay producer that you're buying from that tends to follow given guidelines and parameters for production, whether that be soil testing or forage sampling at the end to tell you something about, what your quality is when you go to buy it. But reputation really is everything in this industry.
That's great. Dr. Tucker, I have one for you. What lab do you recommend for submitting forage samples?
That can be a complicated question, but we always say in extension, it depends, and this one definitely does depend. Some things to think about when you're taking a forage sample is, one, if you've never done it, is making sure you have somebody maybe helping you or following some of the guidelines. And I know there's lots of resources online of how to take a forage sample. A lot of times we're going to recommend talking to your county extension agent, and they're going to be able to provide lab recommendations, especially labs that are within your region or your area. Sometimes, we can take samples and send them off to areas and say, for example, where we're at, where we have Bahia grass, they don't have a lot of that in a lot of other districts. And so making sure that we are getting samples from the locations or using labs that are within our region is very important for getting those good numbers back.
Let's see here. Dr. Baxter, what is the next frontier in hay and forage management?
So definitely an interesting question. There's a lot of technology that you see coming out in the hay industry right now. And a lot of that's kind of stemming from the crop industry. The one piece of precision technology that we can really benefit from as a hay producer is a light bar with a GPS type system for a tractor. For under $5,000, you can take any tractor and turn it into a pretty good precision piece of technology there. The system's going to pay for itself pretty easily within a couple of years just by increased efficiency in your fertilizer, the chemicals that you're putting out, your planting rate. All those steps that we normally take throughout the year are just going to add up in terms of efficiency and management.
Dr. Hicks, how do I get my customers to understand a forage analysis sample and not just buy the cheapest bale of hay?
All right, so the question is coming, I guess, then from the person who's actually producing the hay, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Really, the whole conversation has to start based on a good relationship that has been built between the producer of that hay and your potential or your regular customers. You know, when you try to explain something to someone, they're really not going to understand it and they're not going to believe you unless they feel like they already have a relationship built with you. And so my first question about having a good reputation, that goes a long way to building that relationship. And then once I've got that established, that's whenever the conversation can really open and in explaining maybe what your forage analysis is demonstrating in terms of its nutrient value. That discussion between the producer and the customer, the believability of sharing that information and the importance of it, and saying this is the reason why I charge what I charge for this lot or this cutting of hay. This is based on what my analysis is. And then, and being in all honesty with the person who's buying the hay, yes, this is cheap. I'm going to sell it to you for a little bit cheaper. Here's the reason why. Because the quality is so bad on it that I'm asking you to pay really what is in it. And it all starts, though, with the believability between the producer and the person who's buying it. And that is something that takes time and trust.
Thank you.
I think we got a good follow-up question that talked about like protecting your investment and buying everything. Dr. Tucker, does it pay to have a hay barn?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we get this question a lot. There's lots of producers that produce their hay and have for years, and they don't put them in a hay barn. And we talk about, you know, you're going to pay for it one way or the other. So it's either in loss from storing it outside, and so you're not going to get the full benefit of this high quality product that you've made, or it's by protecting that investment. And by putting up a hay barn and having a place to store this, then you're also able to maintain that quality. You know, you put a lot of effort into the upfront, let's make sure it's still there when it comes time to either sell or feed this product. So it's absolutely worth the investment of having a hay barn.
Dr. Baxter, is there any research or weed control in forages, and how do you control weeds in the field or pasture?
So by far, the bulk of the questions that I get as an extension specialist are, what is this weed and how do I kill it? 90% of my questions every day are related to weed control. The answer is yes. There's an extensive weed control research being done across the country, whether it's independent through universities or paid trials through different companies that we work with. There's a lot of efforts being made to control the problem pasture weeds. We often see that the forages are at a disadvantage compared to many other crops because we don't have as many options. It will look like we have a lot of options, but there's not a lot of different active ingredients that are in there. And so now a lot of us here in the Southeast are battling resistance to those active ingredients. And so we're taking a lot of steps to help prevent that with these new chemistries that are coming out. What can you do in the meantime? Because it takes a decade plus to get a new active out there. By far, as we said in the other session, the best thing you can do to control weeds is to make sure they never have the opportunity to come up. So anything that we can do to make the grass or legume, whatever you have out there, more competitive from the beginning of the season, you just set yourself on a trajectory for success throughout the entire season. So that brings in our fertilizer, making sure that we're not overstocking if we're grazing, or that we're cutting to the right height with the hay. We're getting that hay off in a routine fashion. anything we can do to help that grass grow just pays dividends down the road.
Well, Dr. Hicks, how do you prepare for drought?
Well, we're all, here at the college, we're all the time thinking about that as a possibility. And from the hay production side, we always plan to have more than really what we project to need for that next year. So we're always producing a little bit more to save some back, and we do use storage facilities so that we can, once we've harvested those nutrients, we can store them for a longer period of time. But really, drought preparation is just, honestly, it's part of good pasture and soil management to begin with. As Dr. Baxter was saying, having your regular plants that are competitive and that they can really crowd out those weeds. So you're talking about root health, you're talking about soil health, you're talking about the health of the plants that you have out there. Everything that you're doing every day, even during a season of dormancy for maybe a particular forage, everything you're doing is in a preparation for a future drought. It's once you get into that drought, like so many locations are out west right now, it's having to make those hard decisions. If you have used up those storage reserves, both in the feed itself, but also any reserves in the plant material and in the soil maybe that you have, you really have to, if this is a situation where you do have livestock, you've really got to start thinking those hard thoughts about cutting down on all of the mouths that are trying to feed off of what you do have. Retaining your genetics or, deciding what's the most valuable animal on the place. But drought preparation, it should be something that's always in the back of your mind. And it's just, when you follow proper soil management and proper forage management and you're doing everything right, then basically what you are doing is you are prepping for a drought situation.
Yeah, the time for drought preparation is not during a drought, and that's what we run into a lot.
Yep.
Dr. Tucker, what is a good forage?
Well, that depends. So I guess there's a difference in a good forage and a high quality forage. And really a good forage is the one that best meets your needs, depending on what those are. And that's highly dependent on your work, your environment. Sometimes we can say alfalfa, everybody knows is the queen of forages. That's a great high quality forage. But there are areas that you're never growing alfalfa. So making sure that you have a forage that meets your needs and meets your livestock needs. When you look at what is a high quality forage, then that's where you see, is this something that is consumed in high amounts by the animals, or really, they're wanting to take that in, but it's also meeting their nutritional needs. And so it has a high energy value. And so they're not just consuming a lot of it, but not getting a lot of benefit out of it. And so it can be very different depending on your situation or your location. But I always recommend using the forage that best fits whatever it is in your system, and maybe not what everybody's out saying is, oh, that's the best one to go for right now.
We have one coming in here. Dr. Baxter, what do you see in nutrient difference between high moisture hay and dry hay?
Can you repeat that one? I missed the first
What do you
question.
see in nutrient difference between high moisture hay and dry hay?
Right. So we're going to assume high moisture hay, something like baleage or haylage that's been put up in that 40 to 60% moisture range, not just wet hay. So you don't necessarily improve the forage when when we're wrapping it in plastic. We're protecting more of what was originally there. So when we cut that forage, that's the best quality it's ever going to be. Every step that we go through in that dry down process, we steadily lose a little bit of quality and a little bit of yield. And it's how we manage it through there is what our total loss ends up being. What using high moisture forage, baleage, haylage allows us to do is to protect more of that quality by raking at a higher moisture, baling at a higher moisture, and then protecting it in that plastic wrap. And we're assuming we do all those steps correctly and the fermentation process works. We're protecting more of those more of the leaf material on that forage. And so we've not necessarily improved the final product, but we've protected more of what was originally there. Whereas if we dried it on down for dry hay, we run the risk of leaf shatter because of running equipment improperly. here in the humid South, that extra day to dry it down for dry hay may mean an afternoon thunderstorm on your nearly dry hay you were putting into a windrow. And we can, Dr. Chuck, if you want to expand on that, the high moisture forage and the haylage and baleage are great options, especially for the humid regions, just because it's allowing us to protect those nutrient resources.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say the biggest benefit that we see from a baleage standpoint is that you eliminate that weather factor that we're really seeing an impact of that this summer. We're barely finding 4 days without rain, and when we do get it on the ground, even for baleage, it seems like a pop-up shower's coming. But you can still stick to that 28 to 35 day harvest interval, and that's where you're going to see that quantity and quality like optimum that you're looking for. So you have a good yield, but you still have a really good quality product. So we shoot for that about 4 to 5 week window. And when you have weather impacts like we do with the dry hay product, and you continue to delay rather than putting it up as a high moisture product, as you delay that, you're just continually dropping that quality. You're increasing your yield, but your quality is starting to drop pretty dramatically. And so really being able to eliminate that weather factor, and we can get it cut and get it up in a 24 to 48 hour time period, that's where you see that improvement in quality, because you're able to capture it at the time that you need to capture it rather than having to wait it out.
Well, while we're on that subject, how short should I cut my crop?
So as short as you, no, I'm kidding, not as short as you can get it. So one of the problems that we see a lot in fields, especially it's when it's at the regrowth factor or we're in a drought situation, there's lots of problems, is we go through and we put that mower, especially with these new technologies, just as close to the ground as we can get it, because we want to get that highest quality product and with a high yield. The problem is that as you get so low to the ground, you start to really take off that leaf area and you don't have a solar panel. So if you think about if you raise that mower a little bit higher and you still have somewhat of a leaf there, you have that solar panel to then get those nutrients and get that plant to start to regrow. And so you don't stunt or slow down that process. If we're working with a cool season grass, say a tall fescue or something in one of those areas, we're going to go to about 4 inches is the minimum we want to go to. We don't want to go too far below that. Our warm season grasses like Bermuda grass or Bahia grass, they have a little lower growth point, and so we usually tend to set our mowers at 3 inches. For those. In our mixtures where we have alfalfa and Bermuda, it floats between 3 and 4 inches. Now, when we get to a native grass, those, a lot of these other grasses that have much higher growth points, those are going to have higher or very specific minimums that they're going to have. But the others are pretty rule of thumb. So 4 inches for a cool season, 3 for a warm season.
Dr. Baxter, how do I control armyworms and stem maggot?
So that has been a hot topic in the Southeast, and I'm sure it's in other parts of the country right now as well. The stem maggots they're here to stay for a little bit longer. Something we deal with in Bermuda grass country. So if we have viewers joining from out there, they're probably a little confused about what the stem maggot is we're talking about. The only legal and effective option we have for the stem maggot is a pyrethroid. So we're going to apply any pyrethroid will work. One doesn't necessarily work better than another. Putting out that pyrethroid insecticide 7 to 10 days after you harvest, and then 7 to 10 days later. That second application is crucial, as we've seen in some research here in Tifton. What happens is when we go in and spray, we're only killing the adult flies, and that we still have 2.5 weeks or so of growing conditions after that. So we've got to come in with a second application. So any of the larva that was in the stem that has then emerged as a fly, we catch that generation as well. It would be nice if we had a systemic insecticide to kill that larva, but we don't have any labeled in forage crops. On the armyworm side, we have options. We have several options. What most producers are doing right now, if you can get in there and cut, break out that hay mower and go cut. That's going to be your best tool right now. Because a lot of us are dealing with those larger 1.5 inch or longer, even longer worms. And those are nearly impossible to kill chemically. And so the hay mower is going to be our best bet. After you get that crop cleaned off, ideally we would be going in with something with a really high residual. that's going to give us up to 4 weeks. There are some new combination products out there that have that active ingredient with a pyrethroid. So then you get, kind of 2 for the price of 1 there. So instead of tank mixing yourself, it's ready to pour into the tank. So you can control armyworms and your first application for the stem maggot. We still got to follow it up with another pyrethroid, but we're really encouraging producers towards those combination products. If you don't also have to spray for the stem maggot, you can get something with a long residual by itself. If you are harvesting in the next week, there are products out there with a much shorter residual. There's a number of them that producers are able to use. And since we have people joining from all across the U.S., we'd encourage you to consult whatever your state pest management handbook is. And if you don't know how to access that, contact your county agent, and they should know how to access that.
Dr. Hicks, what's the optimal time to cut hay?
This summer for us in the Southeast has been basically when you've got 3 to 4 days, maybe when the percent rainfall is pretty low. You're really looking at, when you say optimum, that's going to be, optimum could be maximum, it could be minimum, but optimum's always that best in that situation that you have. And so if we're trying to get in and harvest something for either a hay or a baleage, we're trying to hit that sweet spot between your nutrients and your tonnage. We can really harvest great amounts of, or at least high quality nutrients, but the problem with it is that it doesn't justify putting equipment into the field with the price of diesel and labor and everything else that you have, and you're not going to get the tonnage out of it. So there's typically a sweet spot, and some of this is going to be dependent upon what forage that you're choosing. So again, with looking out across the entire country, that's looking at what forage is working for you, that good forage that's going to give you what you need with your systems management approach. Hitting that sweet spot between the tonnage, capturing the nutrients, and then just in all honesty, that sometimes is overridden by the weather, and that just kind of throws everything else out the window. And optimum becomes really when the weather gives you that opportunity.
Dr. Tucker, are protein and TDN linked?
So crude protein and TDN are both factors that producers like to focus on when they get their forage analysis. And a lot of people really like to talk about how they have a really high protein product or something that they've created. Protein really isn't a lacking thing in most of our forages that we deal with when you're trying to feed your livestock animals. It's really not as hard to meet that protein need. And we need to realize that it is a crude number. So it's just nitrogen times 6.25, and it's total nitrogen that's in that forage. So it's just a very crude value to look at. However, TDN is not telling us the protein that's in that forage, it's telling us what the energy is. And while it's a calculation, it's based on other factors outside of that nitrogen component within that plant. So they're linked in that producers can look at them to make feeding decisions or start to develop rations, but the two specifically are separate things. One is looking at the protein factor and the other is the energy factor that this product is providing for our animals.
Dr. Baxter, where do you put fertilizer, and what type of fertilizer do you use?
So it depends on a soil test, number one. What is that soil test telling us that we need to put out there? Because without that, we're just flying blind, and we could be over or under applying a nutrient. And with fertilizer prices right now, we do not need to be over applying anything. So as far as when we put it out during the season, it's going to depend on that crop. But overall, we like to split those applications, especially nitrogen. In a sandier soil like we're in down here, one good rainfall with 3+ inches is not uncommon, and all that nitrogen you put out, it's going to leach right through that soil. So all your investment gone in one afternoon. So by slowly putting that nitrogen out, that's almost like an insurance policy. It's also going to help regulate how much nitrogen that plant can use. So kind of spoon feeding it out there to make sure you're putting it out when that plant actually needs it, not just necessarily when it wants to use it. And then the less we can put out there at any one time, the fewer chances we have for losses. So for a lot of our warm season forages, we're usually around that 50 pounds per acre mark. usually a little lower on cool season, depending on where you're at and what your goals are. When it comes to phosphorus, we tend to put them out in the fall if we need it, just because in dominant row crop areas, spreading services are cheaper in the fall. And so that's an easy way to cut a cost right off the top, is just put it out whenever it's cheapest. Phosphorus, as a general rule, is very stable in the soil, and so whenever it's cheapest for you to put it out, that's a great time. Potassium, we like to split that, especially on our warm season forages. Something like Bermuda grass and potassium is like a kid with ice cream. You put it out there, it's going to take advantage of it and consume more than it really needs. And then again, all the potassium you put out there is gone. So by spoon feeding it out through the season, you're making it use that fertilizer more efficiently. In terms of what type of fertilizer, there's a number of textbooks out there that will show one fertilizer may be better than another. It usually comes down to what do you have available in your area. There's ones that I want to use for research all the time. They're not available in South Georgia. So it comes down to what's available at the local co-op. Generally, we like to use something closest to ammonium nitrate in terms of nitrogen. It's just more stable. We have a hard time with urea type products here, just the viscosity of them, that it breaks down in our humid environment. And a solid turns to a liquid very quickly in 100% humidity with urea. There's a lot of liquid nitrogen products here, fantastic options. We just got to make sure that we're putting them out at a moderate amount and at the right time during the year. Phosphorus, it's whatever's available. There's not a lot of phosphorus sources out there. And then when it comes to potassium, overall we use muriate of potash. It's usually just called potash at the local co-op though. It's by far our most economical source. There are some liquid potassium sources out there for other crops, but they don't pay off for our forage crops.
Dr. Hicks, how do you keep leaves on the hay?
Well, first off, I mean, not to sound like sarcastic or anything, but it's got to be on there to start off with. And this whole issue with us with either stem maggots or fall army worms, that's a big issue. But really, seriously, just in a normal course of the year, the humidity, we really kind of get down on it here in the southeast. But one thing the humidity does is it helps to prevent leaf shatter in a lot of cases. We've got friends out in the west and they talk about, no, we don't start baling or raking or anything until it's like midnight. And they may go and they may bale all night long just to keep enough moisture on those leaves to be able to put it into some type of storage form. But do you realize that the drier that you have it, the whatever forage it is that you have, the greater the risk that you're going to have leaf shatter and you're going to be losing those sources of the nutrients, and that's where the nutrients are at the highest in terms of digestibility. Also realize that there's differences between your forages. As some of our students learn the hard way, you don't treat Bermuda grass and perennial peanut the exact same way. You're not tedding it, for example, to try to get more airflow through it to get it to dry down like we do with Bermuda grasses. Those leaves are very fragile on our clovers and our alfalfas, and for down here our perennial peanut, and you just have to keep the leaf attached to that stem, and so we're thinking about reducing leaf shatter as much as we can. One thing too that I know we've noticed is that the higher quality we get a lot of our forages, especially the younger, if we're cutting it closer to that 24-day mark or so, how much leaf shatter and fines that we get once we've harvested it, once we've stored it. And you can tell when you're running a baler through it how much of that leaf shatter that you're getting. But then you'll also see where some of that loss is when you go to feed it. So if you're feeding a round bale and you cut the net on it and you put it into, say, like a trailer, and all of a sudden you begin to realize that so much of it's just kind of dropping off, that was those leaves that are shattering, are you being able to use those nutrients in it. But moisture's a big part of that, and mechanical damage to the forage that you're trying to work with.
So I have a question for all three of you. What is the most important hay equipment that you can invest in? We'll start out with
I was just
Tucker.
saying, who do we want to start with? So I guess we've kind of talked about this before, and in my opinion, when you start to think about if you were, let's just say you have unlimited funds, but you have to buy one piece of expensive equipment, and I think all of them are important, but in my experience, having a good hay baler is really going to be the key factor. If you could buy a good used mower and it would be easier to fix, or the upkeep on that to still be able to get a good mow or good clean mow out of it. But having a baler, there's nothing worse than maybe a worn out baler, especially if you're in that field needing to, get that crop up. And so in my opinion, I think that, a good baler that's running well, that's what you need to invest in.
So I have a slightly different opinion. So if I had one piece to invest in, I'm going to go with a good mower conditioner. Ideally as wide as you can get for your farm, considering how wide your gateways are. Take that into account. I see a lot in my extension role that people will think they don't have a good baler, but it's because they're running it incorrectly. They're running too fast, RPM's not right, so on and so forth. They're not matching the baler to the crop. And whereas we could really have a lot of impact on our hay production with that mower conditioner. We focus so much on that end product, but it all starts with a good cut. And if we don't get that good, clean, even cut, we notice kind of steady losses throughout that hay drying process. We're going to have uneven stubble height that's left. So these insects that we're talking about, they can go in and kind of attack those taller areas first, and then we've got unevenness in our field, and it just spirals from there. Adding that conditioner, which is really what adds the cost to that piece of equipment, drastically it reduces our dry down time. And so that starts us for success in the haymaking process. If we get that good cut, that's immediately drying down as soon as we roll over it.
Dr. Hicks?
I go on the baler side. That's that one specific point in time that makes the difference between whether I've got something, if I'm going with baleage, it gets too dry, or I'm sitting there and I have it just dry enough, and is that extra 3 or 4 hours with a breakdown, or I've got to wait till tomorrow or something, that's going to be, I've done all this up to this point, and then boom, it just changes everything, and it just makes you feel like just throw the whole thing away then at that point. But I'm on the side of the baler. I've seen that so much of the time. The frustration, we may get started with our mower conditioner. We have a major part that breaks down. Okay, well, maybe I can get it in a day or two. Well, at least I've got half of the field cut, and then I can get in there with the baler. I can get that up. I've captured that. 2 days time, I can come back. I can cut it, and I get the rest of it. But it's still that real point of packaging, that I need to package what I created. So, it's like you said, all of them are important. All of them are important. Although, as we do teach some of the students, sometimes tedders aren't necessary, or fluffers, call both of them. But all of them are necessary. That they're up, they're maintained correctly. They're working when you need it, not when a day after you need it. But everything needs to be ready to roll. But I'm kind of partial to the baler.
So we have a kind of a two-part question here. Dr. Tucker, first part is, what forages work best for baleage or haylage? And secondly, what are the benefits to baleage?
Okay, those are pretty good questions. So first, you can put any forage up as a wet moisture or high moisture product. That's just the top of the bale package. But we do have some rules of thumb. We know that our annuals have higher sugars because they only have to worry about being there for the party that night, right? So they put all their sugars and energy into that leaf and that growth, and that really helps to translate well when you're making a baleage product, because you need those sugars for fermentation. So we tend to lean more towards our annual crops. Next would be our legumes. So, your alfalfas and your clovers or things of that nature that, again, are high in protein. They're going to have a higher sugar, and then you're going to go more to your perennial grasses. We do make either alfalfa Bermuda grass or Bermuda grass baleage here in our area. But really, economically, when it gets to the Bermuda grass only, that's more as a saving. We can't get that product up as a dry hay. If you have the option, we're going to recommend you go with that for dry hay. But for the benefit of baleage, it's the fact that you don't have to wait to harvest those crops. When we work in our alfalfa mixtures, now we are creating something that we're not tedding. We're getting them to maintain that leaf, so we're making that high quality product that's really easy to feed. We made both clover and alfalfa last year in mixtures and baleage, and the palatability of that forage. Our cows were playing King of the Bale, right? So and they lick it up off the ground. So there's just a lot of benefits to leaning towards a baleage system, but it is there's a definite economic input. There's a cost that you have to consider when you're looking at something of that nature. But a year like we're having right now in South Georgia, if you have baleage, you're still making some type of high quality feed product. And if you're doing dry hay, you're having a real hard time getting that product up. So that years like this year, there's a big benefit to baleage.
So continuing on with that question, I'm going to direct it towards Dr. Baxter. What type of sampler is best for collecting dry hay samples versus the baleage samples?
So I think we all have our favorite sampler. I think between the three of us, we all have one that we gravitate towards individually. What we've really seen here, and granted we're using them mostly for research purposes, Dr. Tucker and myself, the bigger diameter core that you can get, the easier your life is when pulling a core out of a baleage bale. There are some out there that they have what they call a spiral assist on the front of it, so it really helps pull that core into the bale. It means a lot to me when I can be on the phone and also taking a forage sample at the same time. So that's important for me to be able to have that ease. Those usually come at a price. So you've got to weigh kind of the pros and cons of each of the types out there. From the research side, like I'm on, I have a single core, so I put it in the bale one time, pull it out, and I've got to dump that into a bag. There's one that Dr. Hicks has that I'm jealous of that has a canister attached to it. So you can pull 15, 20 cores and before you have to dump that into a bag. So it really depends on what price point you want to be at, and then also how many cores and samples are you pulling throughout the season. So if you're somebody that's cutting hay every week somewhere, would definitely gravitate towards one of those kind of, they may be a pricier, but they are a better built hay core.
And some of that's also the sharpness of the end of the core. Because depending on how sharp it is, we've found that when you go to take the core, that if the leaves are sliding off of the tip and you're never really capturing that as part of your sample, then you're really missing the whole deal about why you're wanting to do a forage analysis. So, you can, like you said, we can adapt and we can use a lot of the different ones based on what price point we want to go with. There's going to be challenges with each one of them, maybe extra tools for using a power drill or something to operate it. But what it really boils down to is you've got to have a core that takes a good sample.
Yeah, the best one is one with a sharp point at the end.
Yeah,
Yes.
My hand knows that one too well. But we do recommend drill-driven, at least from our standpoint. There are some of the original cores that they were like a hypodermic needle, is what they kind of look like, and you would like push them in, and you got to have some arm power on those. So I'm definitely on the drill type. So.
Well, we got a kind of a equipment question here. I'll go Dr. Hicks. Does tedding hay increase hay quality or speed the drying process?
Okay, tedding, or for some of the folks that are tuned in, you may refer to it more as a fluffer. Okay, so as my colleagues have said, once you've kind of set the nutrient value at that, it's not going up. It's your if anything, what you're doing now at this point is either stabilizing it or it's dropping. And what the tedding or the fluffing will do is it helps to put more air circulation to within that plant that you have cut and assist you with the drying time. As far as like it aiding and making your TDN better or getting your protein up or anything like that, that's, you know, it's now if I can make it drier and I can then get it packaged in a bale or put somewhere where now it's stabilized, then I feel like, yes, it's helped me with the quality. It just hasn't improved it, but it's helped to stabilize it and at least not getting worse.
Well, we are being directed. We need one more question. So what is the best time of day to cut hay? Who would like to answer that? I'll let someone decide.
To say that one depends too.
Yes, that's another classic. It depends, and everybody's going to have a different answer for that. From a agronomic side and the physiology of the forage, it's best to cut late in the afternoon after the plant has had all day to photosynthesize and take in more and create more sugars. Then you're capturing that higher sugar content and ultimately higher energy in that final product. But as we've mentioned, a lot of us in more humid parts of the country, you make hay when the sun's shining. And so if we know that we've got exactly 3 days before that storm's coming in to get our product dry, we're not going to wait until 6 o'clock tonight to go cut. We're going to cut as soon as that dew starts coming off, as quickly as we can. So it depends on a lot of things there.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for your time and joining us. It's really been a pleasure. I'd like to thank the University of Georgia, ABAC, and ABAC Studios here letting us use their place. There will be a follow-up email shortly with more information on everything.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for everyone joining us. Have a great day.